my sister and Alice's,
You know-
Julia's daughter.
You know how I used to put you to sleep?
Tell me.
At the bottom of your foot like that.
August 1978. A family reunion on the shores of Great Spirit Lake, Iowa. This is Chester Ronning, 85 years old. He's preparing for the baptism of his great-grandchild. Their ancestors were Norwegians, part of the great immigration that poured into the American West in the 1870s.
One, two, three, go!
Go, Chester.
No cheating. Come on, Victoria!
Chester's been everything in his life, from a cowboy to an internationally known diplomat. A man of many parts. But most significantly, he's been a teacher. Chester's younger brother, Talbot, 80, is an active Lutheran minister in Chicago. They grew up together 8,000 miles from here in the oldest civilization on Earth, Imperial China. He's saying, live until you're old. Learn until you're old. And there's still so much to learn. Chester lives in Camrose, Alberta, a small farming community 100 miles southeast of Edmonton, in a house he helped build 50 years ago. Once a month, children visit him from the local school as part of their social studies classes.
And the painting is judged on the basis of how light they can handle and how heavy they can handle the brush. But every leaf is just one stroke. And you see the difference between that stroke, that stroke and this stroke?
Yeah.
You see the difference between that stroke and these strokes? And see the knots here are left?
Yeah.
Now, here are modern Chinese paintings. This, I say, is the grandfather. And he is not too interested in life, is he? He's quiet.
Yeah.
And there's his son. That would be something like your parents.
Yeah.
They take some interest in life. And here you are. And do you see how lively they are?
Yeah.
Are you as lively as that?
Yeah.
The attic of his house is a store of treasures. Photographs, rare porcelains, the tiger he shot with a Maharaja. But the real treasures are the memories of a life. Norway, India, Vietnam, China. Chester's parents, Hannah and Halva Ronning, Lutheran missionaries, arrived on the China coast in December of 1891. Their destination, 700 miles up the Yangtze River, was the city of Hankow, where they were to learn Chinese. Hannah and Halva set out on a 6-week journey by junk up the treacherous Han River. They wanted to set up a mission deep in the interior, in the old China. A 4,000-year-old civilization that saw itself as the Middle Kingdom, halfway between heaven and earth. Halva wrote home to his brother. What a multitude of people, and all of them heathen. Brother, you can hardly believe how hard it is to travel past thousands and millions of fellow beings who as yet know nothing of their Savior. Often we fall on our knees out in the open and pray for these people. But to the Chinese, it was the missionaries who were the barbarians. How could these strangers ever understand the time-revered codes which ennoble Chinese life? They founded their mission in the ancient walled city of Fancheng. Within 3 years, they had built a church, a school, and a home. Here, 6 children were born. 4 of them attended the family reunion in Iowa.
Howdy, 我给你破个名儿，好吧？
可以。
一个老头儿88，先长胡子后长牙，是什么东西？你猜得到？猜不到？
What is an old man who first grows whiskers before he grows teeth?
你再说。
一个老头儿88，先长胡子后长牙，是什么东西？你猜？包谷不对了。
The answer?
包谷啊。
Corn.
Out there we have Ni Gui Xing, what is your name? And the last name comes first and the given name second, so it's Zhang Hongen. Hongen means grace. The Hong character is the vastness, like the vast ocean, and Un means grace. So we have here Hong Un, the grace of God. And that was the name that Father gave our mission in China, Hong En Hui.
Unlike most missionaries, they didn't impose Western ways. Instead, they adopted a Chinese way of life. Their dress was Chinese. In their home, they spoke Chinese. Chester was the first white baby born in Fancheng.
And my mother had no milk for me. And I was brought up on the breast of a Chinese woman. I suppose she brought her own baby into the house with her. And I had to share with him, whoever he was.
Hannah had been a school teacher in Iowa. In Fancheng, she spent long days preaching. But in 3 years, she only baptized 12 converts. Her real work was in education. The first women to enter a school in the region's history were in her classes. Chester and his brother Nelius were brought up by their milk mothers and the cook, who taught them the rhymes and riddles, the fables of a culture that predated the teachings of Confucius. Hannah took the 2 boys into the heart of Fancheng, the market. This was a China Chester would always love. The fascination of Chester's family for Chinese life was not widespread in the European community. In most missionary and trade circles, there was an undisguised contempt for the Chinese people.
It was a question of bringing the gospel to the heathen. And a lot of the people actually believed that all the Chinese who had lived for all of these generations, who had not received salvation and had not been baptized, they'd go to hell. When I finally realized this as a youngster, I said to Father, how can God be so cruel as to damn all of those people to hell? And he said, oh no, he said, that's one way to get into heaven is to be baptized. But we don't know how many other ways there are. We understand only a little of one way.
Halvor wrote home to his brother. Most of the country consists of large tracts of level and beautiful land. All sorts of grains grow here, most of it barley and wheat. There are many things reminding us of Palestine at the time of Christ. China had built the Great Wall to keep out foreigners. It didn't keep out the exploiters. In Shanghai, Hankow, Hong Kong, it was the golden age of imperialism. British, Germans, Americans, French, Japanese. They grew rich on China's immense supply of raw materials and cheap labor. They built streets and parks where signs read, Chinese and dogs not allowed. A fierce resentment was growing among the Chinese. Secret societies formed to expel the foreigner. The Order of Literary Patriotic Harmonious Fists, better known as the Boxers, threatened to drive the strangers into the sea. The missionaries, hundreds of miles away from the protection of foreign gunboats, were the first victims. Finally, the Board of Missions ordered the Ronings out of China.
Well, when we went down the river in junks, you know, the Boxers marched towards the river. We heard them say, "Sa, young Guizel! Kill the foreign devils!"
From Shanghai, they sailed around the world, to Norway, visiting the home of their forefathers. Chester and Nelius learned 2 new languages, English and Norwegian. The news from China was very bad. The Boxer Rebellion was raging, churches were being sacked, missionaries murdered. But when a shaky peace was restored in China, they began the long journey back. Now a boy of 7, Chester was back home. Mandarins ruled with an iron grip.
Neelius and I would often run to the city wall when it was announced that there would be chopping of heads. There would be one man that was the executioner. The prisoners who were to be executed were like this. Oh, it was so distressing to see what they actually did. No, I never got accustomed to that. I shudder now when I see this picture.
The Western powers had brutally suppressed the Boxer Rebellion, protecting their own privileged position. This corruption and oppression was becoming intolerable, especially to the youth of China. A revolutionary movement inspired by Dr. Sun Yat-sen was sweeping the country. The students at the mission studied more than the Bible. Many had memorized the American Declaration of Independence before they could speak English.
The students in my father's school were young revolutionaries. They brought Neelius and me into their meetings. When we learned that they were proposing to throw out the Manchu government, we said, hadn't we better inform our father about this? They called him Lo, was old whiskers. Oh no, don't you say anything to him, said Deng Zipei, who was the leader of the group.
Halva's answer to China's problems was education. Other missionaries concentrated on medical work. Far beyond the reach of either were the staggering social problems: periodic famine, epidemic disease, poverty, misery. In Fancheng, Hannah was appalled at the plight of the children. If a family couldn't marry off a baby girl, she'd be left outside the city to die.
A lot of them never had a choice, because a few hours after they were born, they were either brought out the side of the city gate or left on my mother's doorstep.
She took them home, raising them as her own children. They became Chester's sisters. When there were too many, she built an orphanage. She refused to allow the binding of feet, the centuries-old crippling of the Chinese woman. Hannah wrote home to her family in Iowa. We will never get used to the terrible sight of the bodies of little babies being dragged about by scavenger dogs. My sleep is filled with nightmares of suffering children. The work was taking its toll. Halva's concern was growing. He had built a cottage high in the mountains called Shi Liang, rest in the cool, where they escaped the endless work, the stifling heat. But it couldn't restore her health. Hannah was only 39 when she died.
I remember very vividly, yes. Well, it was a crushing blow for the children. The Chinese loved her too, you know. Yes, oh, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese that came to the funeral.
Hannah and Halva had built up the mission together. How could he carry on the work alone? Chester and Neelius were being sent to school with relatives in Iowa. Chester was 13 years old. His Chinese boyhood was behind him. Halva remained behind. It would take a year to turn the China mission over to others. On their trip, the boys survived a typhoon, a shipwreck, and an outbreak of smallpox, only to arrive in San Francisco in the wake of the devastating earthquake of 1906. At their first day at school in Iowa, they were treated as foreigners.
The kids were all gathered around, waiting for us to come out. And they started to sing, "Ching Chong Chinaman, eat dead rats, chew them up like ginger snaps." We felt so terrible.
But they weren't to stay long. Thousands of Americans were heading north to homestead in the Canadian West. This was the new land of opportunity. A year and a half after Hannah's death, the family was reunited. Chester went to school in Bardo, a Norwegian farming community near Camrose. The province of Alberta was just 3 years old.
This is the spot where my brother and I became Canadians. This is the site of the old Bardo School. And I remember the first fall that we were here. There was snow had fallen, and we got into a quarrel about the United States and Canada. You see, we had been steeped in pro-American propaganda. They didn't call it that in those days, but that's what it was. And we despised Canadians who bowed down to the king. And so my brother and I started throwing snowballs at the Union Jack that was flying here. And boy, the Canadian Norwegian kids got angry at us, and they snowed us under, and properly so. That's why I say from that time on, we didn't dare to be Americans anymore. So we became cowardly Canadians.
Halva was the pastor of the community. He was also a farmer. He gave Chester his first horse, Sailor, to look after the cattle. But he was still a missionary at heart, and restless. In 1911, he persuaded 15 families to follow him on a great trek north to yet another frontier, the Peace River country. For Chester, age 16, it was a dream come true. A wilderness full of adventure, tall tales, and colorful characters. Their new home was the first house built in Valhalla, the home of the gods. The name Halva gave the community. Long before a church was built, Pastor Ronning conducted services from a tent.
Well, all the people sat down and we sang songs. We had a choir here, we had games, and we had a service where he preached a sermon. Good sermon. He took the text, of course, and branched out from the text, and perhaps sometimes he didn't get back. My mother was a cowgirl. She was a beautiful rider. She knew how to handle a horse. I'd hoped that someday I could ride a horse as well as she did.
Chester became a farmer and a cowboy. He was now old enough to file for his own quarter section. He broke horses all through the district. He met his sweetheart, Inga Marie Horte, by claiming that he could break her father's stallion that no one else could ride. It was a remote district. They shot their own food. They'd built a one-room school but couldn't attract anyone to teach. Halver claimed that Chester was a born teacher. At the age of 17, he had a class of 30. But it was to change his life. He decided to become a teacher. He and Nelius went south to the Camrose College in the University of Alberta. They played in the orchestra. Nelius the trumpet, Chester the E-flat cornet. Nelius studied geology, Chester education. They shared a dream of returning to China to carry on their parents' work. Nelius as a missionary, Chester as a teacher. But it was 1917. The Great War raged in Europe. They enlisted and were hastily trained as pilots. Fortunately, before they got to the front, the war ended. Then, on a survey party on Great Slave Lake, Nelius was drowned. Chester would have to carry on the China mission alone. "60 years later, he visits the Valhalla School. Some of the students are great-grandchildren of the class he first taught.
Should I say something in Chinese to you? Okay. 一定恭喜两相好，三行四喜五亏六顺，七个巧七个巧七个巧，八匹马快得力，满福寿。What was I doing?
Counting.
Right. Now can you say? 一、二、三、四、五。What's five? 五。Put out your Norwegian struts. That's better. 六、七、八、九、四。一定恭喜两相好，三行四喜五亏六顺，七个巧七个巧七个巧，八匹马快得力，满福寿。That last is that both your hands full of fingers is what? Good. You pass.
In 1922, Chester Ronning made the final preparations for his China mission. His destination was the city of Fancheng, deep in the interior of China. His aim was to carry on the school his parents had started. Three years before, he had married Inga Marie Horte, and now with their first child, Sylvia, they set out for China. Finally, they were back at the house where Chester was born. Each anniversary, they dressed up in the wedding clothes they had brought across the ocean from Valhalla. years in China began hopefully and peacefully. He and his old friend Deng Sipei were co-principals of the Hangwen Middle School, the school they had gone to as boys. Deng was the boy who had preached revolution in Chester's father's classes. They both believed that literacy was the great need of the day. Schools were spreading throughout the country. Their job was to train more teachers. But Chester was back in China not only to teach, but to learn.
This was my first summer back in China, and I wanted to visit the villages. I visited the mission stations. That was my excuse, visit the mission stations. But I was interested in the peasant people of China, and I learned a great deal. I made friends once with a wheelbarrow pusher. I walked behind him for several days, walking across the province of Hunan, and he became a very fast friend.
It was a China full of boyhood memories. On the Han River, in front of what had been their parents' mission, he and Nelius had once been invited aboard by the cormorant fishermen.
They have a cormorant man who removes the cormorant from his perch, you see, and lets him go into the water with a ring around his neck so that he can't swallow the fish. And there's hooting and yelling, and the cormorants fly for a little ways and they dive into the water, and all of these fish coming in, they're like a miracle. They wouldn't let us help because we would be what the Chinese call "ben su ben jiu," stupid hand, stupid foot.
But throughout China, a great struggle for power was being waged. Most of the country was in the hands of warlords. There was a right wing, later to become the Nationalists, under Chiang Kai-shek, supported by the army and the business community. In Chester's region, a left wing, the reformists of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, had organized a coalition of peasants, workers, and students. At the school, Chester and Deng Sipei were teaching the principles of Sun Yat-sen. The government should serve the people. The peasants, not the landlords, should own the land.
One day as I was standing at the front of the class asking questions in English, all of a sudden they all stood up and they all marched out down to the river. So the whole sandbank was covered with students shouting slogans, and we heard them shouting, "Da Dao Di Guo Zhu Yi, smash imperialism."
Chester had been back in China 3 years when Sun Yat-sen died. It left the reform movement with no true leader. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek routed the warlords. It seemed with the country unified, conditions would improve. But then, in a terrible betrayal, he turned his army on the reformers, the men and women who had been his allies. The police were everywhere.
Chiang Kai-shek's spies went into all the universities to single out the students who were revolutionaries, executed them, shot them against the walls of the university buildings.
The Ronning family was ordered by the British consul to get out of China by any means possible. Deng Sipei was left to carry on the China mission. The Ronnings' trip down the river was terrifying. Angry mobs demanded they be put ashore. Foreigners were being killed. When they finally reached the protection of the American gunboats at Hankow, most of the western population had been evacuated. (1928). Chester was back in Canada as head of his old school, the Camrose Lutheran College. It was here he heard that his friend Deng Sipei had been shot. It seemed the China mission was over. He was so broken in health, his nerves shattered, he couldn't go back to work for a year. Then he was teaching again. He directed a choir from the population of Camrose that for 4 consecutive years he would lead to the provincial choral championship.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan. Come on, sing. Coming for to carry me home.
1929. Good times in Alberta. Fine crops, high grain prices, boom times. Then, quite suddenly, the worst of times. The Great Depression seized the country. On the prairies, it was accompanied by a great drought which was to burn up the crops year after year. The banks began to foreclose on the farmers. He decided he must get into politics. He ran for the United Farmers of Alberta. His platform? The welfare of the common people.
Well, one day a man rapped at my door and he said, you know that you don't stand a ghost of a chance of winning this election campaign. I said, why? Well, he said, you know that they're spreading there's a whispering campaign going all through this constituency about you. They say that you were brought up on the milk of a Chinese woman. Since you were brought up on Chinese milk, you're partly Chinese. And I said, well, if that is the case, then I should be the best candidate in this constituency. You go out and start a whispering campaign about my opponents in this campaign. He said, what do you know about their dark pasts? And I said, well, I have it on fairly good evidence that they were both brought up on cow's milk.
He was elected by a large majority. In the legislature, he was the voice of the little man. He fought for the rights of teachers. He was an enemy of the CPR, the banks, big corporations. He became provincial leader of the CCF, now the NDP. He spoke for a socialist movement in Canada. He lost his seat. He fought to win it back in 4 by-elections in 5 years. He was never re-elected. The world was slipping towards war. In the east, the Japanese had invaded China. In the west, Canada was at war with Hitler. On he and Inga's 22nd anniversary, Chester was again in uniform. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he was made Wing Commander Ronning, head of the Allied Discrimination Unit, with the responsibility of breaking the Japanese code in the Pacific. But it was a moment when his knowledge, his experience of China was more important. Before the end of World War II, he flew over the hump of the Himalayas to Chungking, the wartime capital, to join the staff of the Canadian Embassy. He was accredited to the government of Chiang Kai-shek.
Chiang Kai-shek knelt down in worship of the ancient emperors. Only a person who aspires to occupy the throne does this sort of thing.
The Generalissimo, as Chiang liked to be called, was in supreme command of the government and the Chinese army. But the forces of Zhou Enlai, who had been brought up in a mission school, and Mao Zedong were directing a revolution from the mountain stronghold of Yan'an.
And I sympathized with their side of the case because they were pledged to free China, the Chinese peasants, from the domination, from the vicious oppression of the landlords.
Chester was not the most diplomatic of diplomats. He tried to make his own government understand why the communists were winning the support of the Chinese people.
And so I knew the fervor of the young people of China for a change of the old system. I knew from childhood days.
Mao's followers concentrated on what had always been the purpose of Chester's China mission.
In China, education was worshipped, and education had authority. And Mao Zedong elevated the people to close to that level by making them literate. The first thing he did was to establish schools for kindergartens and for the elementary school and the high school and universities and music schools and trade schools. Education is what liberated China.
Despite $2 billion of U.S. aid, Chiang's forces steadily lost ground to the communists. In 1949, he withdrew his shattered army to the island of Formosa. Mao controlled the mainland. The revolution was victorious. But would the West recognize the People's Republic of China? Lester Pearson, Canada's Minister for External Affairs, decided that Chester should be made ambassador to the new government. It was 1949. His China mission seemed to have triumphed. A year later, Chinese forces entered the Korean War, and it all collapsed. For 20 years, Canada would have no official relations with a quarter of the world's people.
I cook Chinese food for myself twice a day. 普通饭, common food. And I used no cookbook. I remember how our cook did it.
轻快轻快又轻快， 筷子来了，嘴张开。
In 1954, he was in Geneva as head of the Canadian delegation at the conference called on the future of Korea and Indochina. As a man from both worlds, he struggled to mend the differences between East and West. He was able to see his friend Zhou Enlai, but failed completely to convince the Canadians or Americans to recognize the Chinese communists. That same year, he was appointed ambassador to Norway. He and Inga and the children were to spend 3 happy years in the land of their ancestors. In 1958, he was appointed Canadian High Commissioner to India. He became a close friend to Jawaharlal Nehru, the first leader of an independent India. He was 64 years old.
All of this formality meant nothing to me. This formality was all to establish the authority, whereas I was much more in sympathy with revolutionary tradition that I experienced in China.
Once again, his concern was to help an emerging people. As an ambassador, he was more concerned with seeing schools opened than with the details of diplomatic procedure. When Canada funded a mammoth dam in the Negris Hills, Ronning insisted a school be built for the children of the laborers. They built it in a small construction camp they called Ronning Town. In 1965, at the age of 71, Chester decided to retire. He and Inga would go back to Camrose. He wanted to write a book about the rivers of China. But the following year, he was brought out of retirement to go to Hanoi as a peace emissary between North Vietnam and the United States. He insisted that the bombing of the North be stopped as a precondition to negotiations. The bombing escalated. His mission was a dismal failure. But as the war in Vietnam worsened, he publicly spoke out against American policy, seriously damaging his reputation as a diplomat. Soon after his return, Inga died. His children were now spread around the world with families of their own. He was 73 years old. It had been a life marked by many defeats, but ultimate victories. At last, he was to see his China mission fulfilled. In 1970, Canada finally recognized the People's Republic of China, and at the invitation of his old friend Zhou Enlai, he went home.
我住的房子是我们那个地方的最小的房子，所以我现在只有一个。
The house where I live is the smallest in Camrose. I'm alone now. Why should I have a big house? Every day, I make myself 2 Chinese meals. You must come and eat with me. We'll have fried rice and fish. It had taken his parents 6 weeks to get up the Han River to Fancheng. It took Chester just 8 hours. He was going back to his birthplace. It had been 44 years since he had had to flee with his young family in 1927. It was now a modern city of 250,000 people. There were only a few reminders of the Fancheng of the past. The chapel his parents built was now a carpentry shop. The school was still a school.
Well, when I was a teacher in China, I planted a small tree, in the compound used for the primary school. And now when I came back in 71, they were using the tree for one of their exercises. It was a huge tree. Yes, yes. See, some that my father had planted were really huge.
The house where he had lived as a teacher was empty now. But the life of the river remains, not just in memory.
Call the wind. And they call the wind, keep on blowing. And the boat is sailing upstream. If the sailing is good, and you see this panorama against the setting sun, it is marvelous. Then you can function, you can pasture your soul.
With his daughter and granddaughter, Chester visits his mother's grave. Hannah Ronning, born Rorham, 1872. Home, Radcliffe, Iowa. Arrived in China, 1891. Gone before, February 1907.
莫慌，扶到，
扶的好，
不要蹬啊！
差不多啊。十字架，你抬起头看神羔羊。
你现在不要唱歌。
看你的嘴巴他压伤，看你的过犯都。
At the family reunion, Chester prepares for the baptism of his great-grandchild.
Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity.
天上、地下，所有的权柄都赐给我了。 所以你们要去，使万民做我的门徒，奉上父、上子、上灵的灵，给他们实习。
Jason, Topping, Ronning, Rorham, and all the other ancestors, we bless thee. And may God's blessing continue to be with thee all thy life.
Live until you're old. Learn until you're old. And there is still so much to learn. The Camrose College, where he was a student 70 years ago. He's 85 now.
No, you don't forget. You don't become insensitive just because of age. Being associated with students and young people keeps you young.
Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. O my soul, praise him, for he is thy health and salvation. All ye who live
Okay, give us the key. Now softly, softly. Follow my tag. Okay. Once more, hum it. Ready?
Praise to